Welcome to Learning DSLR Back to Basics. My name is Phil Dame. In this episode, episode 3, I'm going to be covering exposure, which is the relationship between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and also talk about camera modes. First of all, let's talk about exposure. Exposure is really about letting light into the camera and getting an accurate, or at least creatively accurate, representation of that amount of light into the finished product, which is your picture. To get a correct exposure, you have to think about how light comes into the camera and the fact that it's affected by 3 core components of the camera. The first is the aperture, which I talk about in episode 2, which is the opening in the lens of your camera that lets in a certain amount of light and can be thought of as the intensity of light, how much light is coming in at any one moment. Second is the shutter, which is the mechanism that physically opens and closes and lets in the amount of light over a period of time, be it half a second or 5 seconds. So that controls duration. And then finally, your sensor. The sensor in the cameras itself is sensitive to light and can be made more sensitive in the sense that if a little bit of light is coming in, it can read that signal and boost it by changing the ISO setting. And the best way I like to explain this is it's kind of like the speakers on your stereo system. If you're listening to very clear, well-recorded music, you don't need to have the volume very loud and you get very good signal, very good sound. But if it was recorded very poorly and it's very low and you have to turn that volume up to like 8, 9, or 10, you're going to hear a lot of hissing and noise, and it's because everything is getting amplified. The amount of signal relative to the ambient noise is not very good, so the signal to noise ratio is very low. And so ISO is kind of like that volume dial in your camera, and it's that sensitivity. So aperture, intensity, shutter is the duration, and ISO is just how sensitive is your camera to that light. All of these things work in concert to control the exposure of your final photograph. So let's look at each of them separately. Aperture, we talked about again in episode 2, has a number of aperture values, and the small aperture or smaller hole has a larger ratio number. So f22 is a smaller aperture than f2.8. f2.8 therefore means it's a larger aperture, a bigger opening, letting in more light. So I've got 2 light bulbs there to signify that more light is being let into your camera on the left side than the right. And it has a creative effect as well. And I won't go into this intensely because I really want to talk about more the relationship between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO rather than any of the individual aspects. But it's good to know that a small aperture or a small hole increases the depth of focus or depth of field, meaning that more of what you're shooting or focusing on, what is before and after it, will be in focus. So take this sample group shot, all 3 people are going to be in focus if the aperture is small, let's just say f8 to f22. If you open up your aperture very large, like f2.8 or f1.4, you're getting a much more shallow focus depth or depth of field. And so only what you're focusing on is really going to be sharp. And this, of course, creates great creative control to bring people's attention to what it is you want to focus on. But, for example, would be not very good for landscapes in which you want a very big depth of field so that all the grass and mountains and sky are all looking sharp. Next, we have exposure, which is, shutter speed, which is the duration, and that's measured in the amount of seconds that the shutter is actually opened or closed. So cameras can be as fast as 1/8,000th of a second these days, and of course it can be very slow, and most cameras kind of stop at around 30 seconds. So in this kind of scale, you've got the very fast shutters on the right, letting in very little light because it's a very quick clip, and to a slow shutter that lets in quite a lot more light. And what the creative kind of benefit there is that a very fast shutter will freeze action. If someone was running, you wouldn't see any blur, you would have them frozen in time. And if you were shooting a fountain, the water droplets would be incredibly crisp at 1/8,000th of a second. And then on the left side, you would be capturing motion blur. Often this is not desired. This might be camera shake. You're unable, if you're not using a tripod, unable to hold the camera steady for the actual photo. But motion blur can be an important creative controlling element if you're doing panning shots or want to show motion, or you want to show the wheels of a car turning. Then it's important to incorporate a slower shutter speed into the equation. And then there's ISO. ISO, for the most part, can be said to be it doesn't come into play creatively in the same way that shutter speed and aperture are, in the sense that 100 ISO gives you less noise, and that means again that there's a lot more light coming in into the actual camera. So it's very easy for the camera to differentiate good light, the desired light, versus just the ambient noise. And having a lot of noise leads to kind of a speckled picture that has less sharpness, and it's just not desirable at all. So for the most part, you're always wanting to shoot a very low ISO. Now let's look at balancing these specific values. So let's just assign X, Y, Z to the three parameters that we have. If we set them in a balanced way, we're going to get the picture that we expect. So let's just take some arbitrary values. Let's just say that for a particular picture, our camera, maybe on full auto mode, is telling us that at an ISO setting of 200, a shutter speed of a second, it must be on a tripod here, and a good aperture of f4, I'm going to reproduce the photograph of the light bulb exactly as it should be. Now, if I start to tweak any of these things, what's nice is that your camera is completely calibrated so that a change in any of these can be offset by a change in the other value. So if I, for example, double my ISO, I can change or reduce my shutter speed by half, and I'll still get the right image. So let's look at that. So let's take this example and take our ISO, and instead of ISO 200, let's cut it in half to ISO 100. What's going to happen is that you're going to have an underexposed image. So if you were on full manual and you wanted to compensate for that, you could, for example, double your shutter speed. So as soon as I double my shutter speed to 2 seconds, I've completely offset the fact that I brought my ISO from 200 to 100. The camera was made less sensitive to light, but then I let in twice as much light from a duration standpoint, and I get a perfect exposure. So this would be the same for aperture. So rather than having increased my shutter speed by 2 seconds, I might make a different decision, if it's possible, based on the lens I have, and say, you know what? I'm going to increase the aperture opening size so that it's twice as big, and I've got that marked from f4 to 2.8, and again I would get a perfect exposure. So camera modes give you control of these parameters in different ways. So we have on all cameras, all SLR cameras, an aperture priority mode, a shutter priority mode, and a manual mode. And on your camera, it's either Canon would call that for aperture mode AV for aperture value. On Nikon, it would be A. Shutter priority on your Canon is TV for time value. Again, it's duration. Nikon just simply calls it S. And I think for both cameras, it's an M for manual mode, in which you control all three parameters. So let's look at aperture priority mode. All you're really saying is that I creatively want to set my aperture. I want, for example, very little depth of field. I really want to show one thing in focus and blur out everything else. And so you can set your aperture priority mode, and now your dial, your finger wheel, is going to control only the aperture, and the other two values of ISO and shutter are going to be set for you totally automatically, and you're always going to get a perfect exposure, relatively speaking. Now in shutter priority mode, it's just exactly what you think. You're saying, okay, I really want to get quite a bit of motion blur here. I'm going to expose for a second and let this, perhaps a scene with a car going by. I want to have the lights trailing through the photo, so I'm going to set that for a second, and then you can know with confidence that both aperture and ISO are going to be set for you on your behalf. And it's worth noting here that ISO doesn't have its own setting. There's no ISO priority, and again, it's because no one necessarily wants to push their camera into having a high ISO picture. But you can lock in your ISO in either aperture or shutter priority mode. So let's just say I'm doing that shot of the car going by, and it's an evening shot. I don't want a lot of speckle or noise. I really want it to be crisp, relatively speaking. So I'm going to set it to a very low ISO of 100, so very low sensitivity. Now your camera's going to have to compensate with the only parameter that's left free to be automatic, and that's aperture. And this, of course, you might run into problems if your aperture on your lens can't get big enough to compensate. You might end up with an underexposed photo, but let's just say that isn't the case. In this case, I had fixed my ISO from 200 to 100, so now my aperture has to open up from f4 to 2.8. So in this case, it worked out. So ISO does come into play in both of those modes, but beware that if you do fix it, especially at a very low value, it can work against you, and you might end up with underexposure. Sometimes setting an ISO setting of a higher value is actually beneficial when it comes to doing things like flash photography and what have you, but that's outside the scope of this episode. So finally, there's manual mode, and what manual mode isn't necessarily the setting of all three. In fact, it's really the setting of both shutter and aperture priority, so that you can say creatively, I want a smaller aperture and a longer shutter speed, and then you let the ISO kind of float as the automatic value, and it will go up and down as needed, again within a range of what's possible. If you get an under or overexposed image, you're going to have to tweak that, but you're still kind of in an automatic mode here. Unless you now lock down the ISO so that it's fixed as well, you're not really in full manual mode. And so if you did this, again, it's not that kind of a scary proposition. You could set all three values, take a picture, and if you see that it's underexposed, then you know that you have to do something. You either have to make the camera more sensitive, go from ISO 200 to 400. You either need to let in more light, go from 1 second to 2 seconds, or you have to open up your aperture from f4 to f2.8 as an example, and then keep tweaking that. What's really great about manual mode is that once you do have it set for a particular scene, you don't have to change the values, and you can continually take shots and get great consistency from one photo to the next. So let's look at these three together. So I've got all my aperture values and shutter values and ISO on one screen here, and let's just say some theoretical photo requires us, or we've decided to get the right exposure, it's going to take an aperture of f11, lots of depth of field. We've got a shutter speed of a 60th, just fast enough for me to hand hold it without a tripod. And then I've got an ISO of 200, so really crisp ISO level, not too much noise. But then I make a decision that, I'm not doing very well hand holding at 1/60th. I'm getting some blur, or my subject's moving a little bit, and so I really kind of need to freeze the action a little bit more. And so I decide that I need to move up to a 2/50th of a second. On your camera, a move like that is considered 2 stops of light, because I'm going from I'm doubling the shutter speed and then doubling it again. And if you look in episode 2 of DSLR Back to Basics, I cover light stops very thoroughly. So again, because your camera is calibrated so that all three of these parameters work together, if I if I take away 2 stops of light, that's actually what I'm doing here, is I'm saying I'm going to let in half as much light if I go from 1/60th to 1/25th, and then I'm going to let in half of that by going from 1/25th to 2/50th. So I need to now compensate with either aperture and ISO. So again, let's assume we're on manual. And so I can move from f11 and say, well, I'm going to make the aperture twice as big, so I can go to f8. And if I want to make that again twice as big from f8 to let in twice as much light, then I go to f5.6. Alternatively, I could have simply moved my ISO from 200 to 400, then 800. Then that meant, again, 4 times more light, or 2 stops more of light. And so everything would remain in balance, and I would get a perfect exposure. And it's worth noting that on your camera, when we talk about stops, and that's part of the reason I wanted to bring it up again in this episode, is your camera is set up so that for all the parameters, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, the the clicks on the click wheel as you change these settings are set up to be 1/3 stops. So it takes 3 clicks to move a stop. And so my previous example would have been 6 clicks to go 2 stops. The 1/3 stops are great because they give you that fine-grained control, and it's very clear that when you're moving things around, that there's equivalence across all of the settings. So if I go from F5 to F5.6, that's 1 click, that's a 1/3 stop, and that would let in less light. Now, if I wanted to do the same thing on shutter speed, I could go from 1/30th to 1/40th, again with just 1 click. And ISO, it's same thing, 250 to 200, 1 click. So you almost don't even need to look at the settings. I could, for example, take a picture and say it's a perfect exposure, but now I want, more shutter speed. I can click the shutter dial in one direction and then modify my aperture. Again, say I'm in manual mode, going the opposite way, 1 click. And again, now the camera and the exposure are perfectly balanced as I've added a 1/3 of a stop in one area and taken a 1/3 of a stop of light out in another area. So do kind of take a look at your camera and look at how that's set up, and be cognizant of the fact that each click is a 1/3. So 1, 2, 3, you've got a full doubling of light, and you can add or remove that light consistently across all 3 and know that you're doing exactly the same thing. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to comment here on my blog or on the YouTube post. Be sure to visit my blog at learningdslr.com or connect with me on the social web at either Facebook or Twitter at Learning DSLR. Thank you.